Hi, this is chapter 3. This chapter is looking at specifically at the American society and changing values among American consumers over the past, say, 50 years or so. So again, here we orient ourselves just in terms of where we're at with the framework of the course. We're still here in external influences talking about culture. Just this time we're talking more specifically about American culture. There's a lot of things in this chapter. We're going to focus on cultural values in America. We're going to talk a little bit about green marketing and cause-related marketing. We're just really going to touch on each of these topics. So I like this chart that's in your book that really looks at I really like this chart that really shows where traditional American values are on each of these different types of values, and then also where we currently are, and also where we're moving. So you can see that in some cases, like the active category, in terms of self-oriented values or other issue-oriented values in terms of where we are between limited and extended family, those are still, the same, whether they're traditional or emerging or current, and then others you could see that we've moved relatively far. For example, the very first one, moving from traditionally a pretty religious society to a more secular society, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then, traditionally, for example, we were sort of on that overcoming nature category on the very extreme, and now we're moving towards admiring nature instead. And so you can see there are some other changes, but those are just a couple of them. We're also going to talk about postponed versus immediate gratification in a moment. So the three types of cultural values that we're going to talk about are those three: self, environment, and other oriented values. The other oriented values we touched on in the last chapter. Those are the ones that Hofstede talks about and are typically what we use to, or most often what we use to compare different countries or different regions around the world. In terms of self-oriented values, I want to talk just about a couple of them today in this lecture. The first one is this religious versus secular value. Like you saw on one of the beginning slides, we are traditionally more of a religious society, but have moved more towards being a secular society. And so I think generally speaking, we would be considered a secular society at this point. However, if you look at the data and the research, about 82% of Americans claim some kind of religious affiliation. The largest one in America is Christianity. 54% say religion is important to their lives, and 30% attend church weekly. They believe that one is trending downwards. So if you think about how does this impact consumer behavior, right? Think about in your own life, if this applies to you or people that you know, how would you say that this impacts consumer behavior? So let me give you a couple of examples. First, the first one that comes to mind for me is actually looking at the traditional sort of Sabbath in the US, right? Sundays are the traditional religious day. And so we see that a lot of times families tend to have a big family Sunday dinner. Whether or not they even still go to church, that tradition has still in a lot of places persisted. And so we see that type of consumer behavior, those traditional consumer rituals. And then we also see that companies respond to this in terms of a lot of companies are open on Sunday. That has changed somewhat. And that has changed somewhat in more recent times, and is you can still certainly go to a restaurant on Sunday or something. But we still see that places like Chick-fil-A are closed on Sunday to give their employees the day off. And they feel like that's important. So that's one example. Another example would be, this is the one I really think of. So the town I grew up in is probably 80+% Catholic. And so Lent is a really big part of the Catholic faith and tradition. And part of Lent is that part of that is that on Fridays during Lent, Catholics do not eat meat. And so if you ever had a filet of fish sandwich from McDonald's, you may notice that it always comes out in the springtime. It's a kind of a limited availability item. And it's generally available like February, March, April. And so the reason, and you can read the article on Blackboard that I posted, and this particular product was actually created by a McDonald's operator in Ohio because his town where he operated his McDonald's was about 87% Catholic, and he just really couldn't afford to have no one coming to eat at his restaurant every single Friday for the length of Lent, right? And so he came up with this idea to have the fish sandwich because fish is allowed on Fridays, but other types of meat are not. And so that has persisted since I believe it was the 1960s-ish that they developed this, 60s or 70s. And so now we still have the filet of fish sandwich. And it's just a good example of how religion has impacted consumer behavior in this country, and then how companies have responded to that, in this case with product development, and then the limited time distribution. Another really important one is this move from sensual gratification, or from abstinence to be more accepting of sensual gratification. The biggest place we see this is probably not really in terms of exactly consumption per se, but actually in terms of what we are accepting of in terms of advertising, right? So Axe is pretty famous for their advertising in this regard. And so you see here, this is a good example of sensual gratification. This would have been, even in the 70s or 80s, not a particularly acceptable ad. Okay. Then we have postponed versus immediate gratification. This is another important one for consumer behavior, especially. We traditionally are a society where we really valued postponed gratification and working hard to meet a goal and then getting that gratification. We saw this start to shift after World War II, but really this accelerated in the 1970s and early 1980s, especially with the development of mass marketed credit cards, right, and other types of debt. And with credit cards, it's exactly this shift. It is a really good example of a shift from postponed versus immediate gratification. If I can't afford something now, it's okay. I can just put it on my credit card and I can pay it off later. Okay, but I still get that immediate gratification. And let me just show you a couple of examples here. I'm going to point out the Great Recession in some of these. Okay, this is auto loans just in the past from 2007 to 2017. Okay, you could see that really after the Great Recession, that market really exploded. Again, consumer debt, we have the Great Recession where debt started to go down a little bit and then skyrocketed. This one actually is a little bit longer time span. It starts back in 1982, and you could see the personal savings rate on the red bar and then the household debt in terms of GDP and on the blue bar. And so what we see is that savings has gone down, debt has gone up. And generally for a society, it's a definite indicator of this idea of immediate versus postponed gratification. And generally speaking, we also would take this to show that this is not particularly good financial consumer behavior of American consumers. I believe the average American holds about $5,000 in credit card debt. Not that they're paying off every month, but they're paying, the minimum payment or something close to. And most Americans really couldn't afford the $1,000 emergency. And that is a change in consumer behavior that has resulted from this change in consumer behavior. So we see a lot of products and advertising related to this, whether that's payday loans. There's a lot of auto advertisers, auto companies that advertise, no credit, it's okay, or bad credit, no problem. I've even seen realtors advertise this way, and really just advertising that debt is okay, and it's that's a normal thing to do. So this looks at outstanding credit card debt in the billions. Okay, so again, you see this shift, this consistent increase from the 80s to 2008. Then we had the Great Recession where that started to go down, but now we're trending back upwards. Self-oriented values also include things like hard work versus leisure. We definitely see that hard work is by and large the value in America. Okay, a couple of really interesting facts. About 2/3 of women with children work outside the home, and that is growing. And then I think this number has probably grown, but 51 to 65% of people check their work email on weekends. And there's a lot of research about why this is really not a good thing for people's mental health, but it has sort of become expected in some industries. Environment-oriented values look at the society's relationship to its physical environment, but also to economic and technical environment. The big things here are things like cleanliness, tradition and change, problem solving versus being fatalistic, etc. Interestingly, I think cleanliness is one that's kind of interesting. There's definitely a move towards this minimalistic movement in America.